Hello and welcome to this Mythconceptions video from NET English. This week we're focusing on the play Macbeth and the character of Banquo. It was a slightly more niche one this week, but this has come up in lessons, so I thought it was worth addressing. Essentially, our mythconceptions, which we're going to test, evaluate, decide whether we think they're right or they're wrong, that kind of idea, are these. Firstly, that Macbeth arranges the murder of Banquo because fundamentally Banquo knew too much, knew about the witches, there for the prophecy, that sort of thing. And secondly, because Banquo suspected Macbeth of involvement in Duncan's death. So why would people believe that? Well, fundamentally, this one seems like common sense. Macbeth is scared of Banquo. He literally says, "Our fears in Banquo stick deep" in Act 3, Scene 1. Because Banquo was present when the witches made their prophecy. He knows what they said, and he disapproved. So that phrase from Macbeth, "He chid the sisters when the first they put the name of king upon me." Banquo told off the witches. He reprimanded them. And of course, Banquo, as we know as an audience, although Macbeth doesn't, we know that he does suspect Macbeth. So again in Act 3, Scene 1, Banquo says, "I fear thou playedst most foully for it." There's also this idea that Banquo seems to have almost turned down the idea of supporting Macbeth back in Act 2, Scene 1. So there's that line from Macbeth where he says, "If you shall cleave to my consent, when 'tis it shall make honour for you." And it's almost like Macbeth is very gently, very subtly making some sort of offer to Banquo. So when Banquo responds with, "So I lose none in seeking to augment it, but still keep my bosom franchised and my allegiance clear," that bit at the end of that, "my bosom franchised and my allegiance clear," is Banquo essentially saying that he's loyal to the regime in place, to Duncan. He's not someone who's going to morally compromise, in a sense that he can't be bought. So let's muddy these waters a bit. What are the arguments against that idea? Well, firstly, it's all a bit more complicated than all of that in terms of who Banquo is and also how Macbeth sees him. So we think back to the start of the play. Banquo from the very beginning is an equivalent to Macbeth. So there's a phrase in Act 1, Scene 2, "Our captains Macbeth and Banquo." They're both described as being eagles compared to a lion, to being cannons overcharged with double cracks. It's very, very clear that Macbeth is a hero at the start of the play, or at least is seen as a hero, and Banquo is seen as essentially his equal. Banquo is also widely respected in the play. And I think a really important moment for this is when Macduff finds Duncan's body in Act 2, Scene 3. It's Banquo he calls first. So the line is, "Banquo and Donalbain, Malcolm awake." It's Banquo who is the first person summoned. It's also noticeable that when they're trying to organise the investigation into the murder, that it's Banquo who takes charge. He says, "Let us meet and question this most bloody piece of work," and commits to this idea that "in the great hand of God I stand." He's asserting his religious purity. And that is important because, unlike Macbeth, Banquo maintains his moral purity from the start of the play. So even when he speaks to the witches, he says that he neither begs nor fears your favours nor your hate. He says to Macbeth, "Can the devil speak true regarding the witches?" He calls them instruments of darkness. So Banquo is very, very clear that the witches are essentially evil, that they can't be trusted, they will try and cause problems for people and for the world in general. So when then, in Act 2, Scene 3, he asserts this idea that "in the great hand of God I stand," he's someone we can actually believe. He's someone who's stuck to his beliefs. And also, he's maintained his loyalty. And again that line, "my bosom franchised and my allegiance clear." It's not that Macbeth is openly trying to corrupt Banquo, but it's very, very clear that Banquo, although he supports Macbeth and likes Macbeth and is close to Macbeth, he's not someone who's going to betray his morals. There's also, though, an idea that Banquo is immediately introduced in Act 1, Scene 3 as being greater and happier than Macbeth. And that's because, although he won't be king himself, his children will be kings. And of course, as ever, worth clarifying, not his direct children. It doesn't mean that Fleance is going to become king, but his descendants, his children's 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 children. And of course, as we know, in terms of the context of the play, that King James believed he was descended from Banquo. And that's why Banquo, as a result, is immediately in the play linked to imagery of fertility and growth. And there's lines around the seeds of time, what grain will grow in Act 1, Scene 3. Or then in Act 1, Scene 4, when he says to King Duncan, if I grow, the harvest is your own. There's this pattern of imagery around growth, around plants, around fertility. And that's all to do with the fact that Banquo has children. And don't forget that one of the beliefs at the time is that having children is a symbol of divine approval. If you're unable to have children, if you're sterile, it's because God is punishing you. And again, that juxtaposes for us Macbeth, the figure of sterility and death, and Banquo, the figure of life and growth. Now, this brings us to the most important bit, really, which is Macbeth's speech in Act 3, Scene 1. And this is really where we get a sense of what it is that Macbeth feels about Banquo. So as we've already said, it's really clear from the start that Macbeth is scared of Banquo. He literally says, our fears in Banquo stick deep. So stick deep, almost like he's being stabbed by his fears of Banquo. And it's because of the kind of person that Banquo is. So in the speech, Macbeth says that Banquo essentially is kingly. There's this idea that he says in his royalty of nature reigns that which would be feared. And he's using this vocabulary around kingship, royalty, reigns. And that does link, of course, to this idea around the prophecy that Banquo's children will someday be kings. But it's also because of the sort of person that Banquo is. Banquo behaves like someone who should be royal. Banquo is also daring and brave. 'Tis much he dares, Macbeth says. But what Banquo also has is that he is wise. He hath the wisdom, Macbeth says. And that Banquo, as a result, he's daring and he's brave, but he's also wise. And that means that he's very, very sure-footed. He doesn't really make mistakes, Banquo. And that's what allows him to act in safety, as Macbeth puts it. In fact, the only person at this point in the play that Macbeth fears is Banquo. And Macbeth says, there is none but he whose being I do fear. And that is partially because of what Banquo knows, yes, but it's really even more because of who Banquo is, the sort of person that he is. And it's noticeable that Macbeth seems to feel inferior compared to Banquo. So this line around his genius being rebuked as Mark Antony's was by Caesar. Well, Caesar was the leader. Mark Antony was his friend, his ally. But Caesar was the one who was theoretically in charge. But Macbeth here is comparing himself to Mark Antony and Banquo to Caesar. Caesar, of course, tried to become emperor in ancient Rome. So Macbeth feels inferior. And why? Fundamentally because Banquo is fertile. And in this speech we get a whole lot of references to this. He's father to a line of kings. Banquo's issue, the seed of Banquo. They're all to do with fertility and growth. And that contrasts Macbeth, who has a fruitless crown, a barren sceptre, and mentions this idea of there being no son of mine succeeding. Macbeth is not going to leave his throne to any children of his own. So what does that mean then for Macbeth? Well, yes, it's about who Banquo is, but it also means that if Macbeth wants to leave his throne as king to his children, he doesn't have any, but he wants to someday. So if that's going to happen, he's got to find a way of changing things, controlling things. So killing Banquo also represents Macbeth's attempt to change his fate, to control his destiny. And that's this line, rather than so, come fate into the list and champion me. And what he's doing is using the imagery of jousting here, that fate essentially is going to joust on Macbeth's behalf and try and win for him. Because if Macbeth can kill Banquo and kill Fleance, then the prophecy is wrong, and that might mean that Macbeth someday can have children, reproduce, leave his throne to someone that he has issued. So where does this leave us then? Well, the idea that Macbeth arranges the murder of Banquo because Banquo knew too much, including about the witches, is logical. It does make sense in the play. And also this idea that Macbeth doesn't trust Banquo and sort of feels that Banquo doesn't trust him as well. And he's right. So both of those are actually, they're valid reasons. They're not wrong. But the more important reasons, really, are because Macbeth is jealous of Banquo, he feels inferior to Banquo, and fundamentally, because Macbeth is trying to control and to change his own destiny. And don't forget really that the great irony of the play is that by trying to control his destiny, including by killing Duncan, by killing Banquo, Macbeth actually causes his own downfall. And there we have it. So, Macbeth had Banquo killed because he knew too much is not wrong, but there's some answers that are maybe more right. Thank you very much for your time today. Hopefully that's been useful, and I'll see you in the next one of these that we do.